historians agree that World War II began with the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 and the British and French declarations of war on Germany 2 days later. Dates for the beginning of the Pacific War include the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War on the 7th of July 1937, or the earlier Japanese invasion of Manchuria on the 18th of September 1931. Other proposed starting dates include the Italian invasion of Abyssinia on the 3rd of October 1935. The British historian Anthony Beevor views the beginning of World War II as the battles of Khalkhin Gol fought between Japan and the forces of Mongolia and the Soviet Union from May to September 1939. Others view the Spanish Civil War as the start or prelude to World War II. The date of the war's end is also not universally agreed upon. It was generally accepted at the time that the war ended with the armistice of the 15th of August 1945, VJ Day, rather than with the formal surrender of Japan on the 2nd of September 1945, which officially ended the war in Asia. A peace treaty between Japan and the Allies was signed in 1951. A 1990 treaty regarding Germany's future allowed the reunification of East and West Germany to take place. No formal peace treaty between Japan and the Soviet Union was ever signed, although the state of war between the two countries was terminated by the Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration of 1956, which also restored full diplomatic relations between them. The aftermath of World War I brought significant changes to the European political landscape. The League of Nations Assembly, held in Geneva, Switzerland in 1930, was a key event in this period. World War I had radically altered the map of Europe. The Central Powers lost territories through peace treaties, leading to the creation of new nation-states from the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. To prevent another world war, the League of Nations was established in 1920 by the Paris Peace Conference. Its main goal was to prevent armed conflict through collective security, disarmament, and peaceful negotiations. Despite the strong pacifist sentiment after the war, nationalism grew in several European states. In Germany, this was fueled by the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed significant territorial, colonial, and financial losses. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all overseas possessions, faced reparations, and had limits on its military. The German Empire dissolved, leading to the Weimar Republic. Italy, although an Entente ally, was dissatisfied with post-war territorial gains. From 1922 to 1925, Mussolini's fascist movement took power in Italy, aiming to create a new Roman Empire. Adolf Hitler, after a failed coup in 1923, became Germany's chancellor in 1933. He abolished democracy, pursued a racially motivated world order, and began rearmament. France, seeking an alliance with Italy, allowed Italy's colonial ambitions in Ethiopia. The situation worsened in 1935 when the Saar Basin reunited with Germany, and Hitler accelerated rearmament and introduced conscription. Following the Japanese false flag Mukden incident in 1931, the Japanese shelling of the American gunboat USS Panay in 1937, and the 1937-1938 Nanjing Massacre, Japanese-American relations deteriorated. In 1939, the United States notified Japan that it would not be extending its trade treaty, and American public opinion opposing Japanese expansionism led to a series of economic sanctions, the Export Control Acts, which banned U.S. exports of chemicals, minerals, and military parts to Japan, and increased economic pressure on the Japanese regime. During 1939, Japan launched its first attack against Changsha, but was repulsed by late September. Despite several offensives by both sides, by 1940 the war between China and Japan was at a stalemate. To increase pressure on China by blocking supply routes, and to better position Japanese forces in the event of a war with the Western powers, Japan invaded and occupied northern Indochina in September 1940. Chinese nationalist forces launched a large-scale counter-offensive in early 1940. In August, Chinese communists launched an offensive in central China. In retaliation, Japanese armies in North China implemented the Three Alls policy, a massive scorched earth initiative to depopulate regions deemed hostile to Japanese occupation. continued antipathy between Chinese communist and nationalist forces culminated in armed clashes in January 1941, effectively ending their cooperation. In March, the Japanese 11th Army attacked the headquarters of the nationalist Chinese 19th Army but was repulsed during the Battle of Shanghai. In September, Japan attempted to take the city of Changsha again and clashed with Chinese nationalist forces. German successes in Europe prompted Japan to increase pressure on European governments in Southeast Asia. The Dutch government agreed to provide Japan with oil supplies from the Dutch East Indies, but negotiations for additional access to their resources ended in failure in June 1941. In July 1941, Japan sent troops to southern Indochina, threatening British and Dutch possessions in the Far East. The United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western governments reacted to this move with a freeze on Japanese assets and a total oil embargo. At the same time, Japan was planning an invasion of the Soviet Far East, intending to take advantage of the German invasion in the West, but abandoned the operation after the sanctions. Since early 1941, the United States and Japan had been engaged in negotiations in an attempt to improve their strained relations and end the war in China. Japan advanced a number of proposals which were dismissed by the Americans as inadequate. At the same time, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands engaged in secret discussions for the joint defense of their territories, in the event of a Japanese attack against any of them. Roosevelt reinforced the Philippines, an American protectorate scheduled for independence in 1946, and warned Japan that the United States would react to Japanese attacks against any neighboring countries. Frustrated at the lack of progress and pressured by American-British-Dutch sanctions, especially in oil, Japan prepared for war. Emperor Hirohito, after initial hesitation about Japan's chances of victory, began to favor Japan's entry into the war. As a result, Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe resigned. Hirohito refused the recommendation to appoint Prince Naruhiko Higashikuni in his place, choosing War Minister Hideki Tojo instead. On the 3rd of November, Nagano explained in detail the plan of the attack on Pearl Harbor to the Emperor. On the 5th of November, Hirohito approved in Imperial Conference the operations plan for the war. On the 20th of November, the new government presented an interim proposal as its final offer. It called for the end of American aid to China and for lifting the embargo on the supply of oil and other resources to Japan. In exchange, Japan promised not to launch any attacks in Southeast Asia and to withdraw its forces from southern Indochina. The American counter-proposal of the 26th of November required that Japan evacuate all of China without conditions and conclude non-aggression pacts with all Pacific powers. That meant Japan was essentially forced to choose between abandoning its ambitions in China or seizing the natural resources it needed in the Dutch East Indies by force. The Japanese military did not consider the former an option, and many officers considered the oil embargo an unspoken declaration of war.
Allies gained momentum. 1943 to 1944, after the Guadalcanal campaign, the Allies initiated several operations against Japan in the Pacific. In May 1943, Canadian and U.S. forces were sent to eliminate Japanese forces from the Aleutians. Soon after, the United States, with support from Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islander forces, began major ground, sea, and air operations to isolate Rabaul by capturing surrounding islands and breach the Japanese Central Pacific perimeter at the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. By the end of March 1944, the Allies had completed both of these objectives and had also neutralized the major Japanese base at Truk in the Caroline Islands. In April, the Allies launched an operation to retake western New Guinea. In the Soviet Union, both the Germans and the Soviets spent the spring and early summer of 1943 preparing for large offensives in central Russia. On July 5, 1943, Germany attacked Soviet forces around the Kursk Bulge. Within a week, German forces had exhausted themselves against the Soviets' well-constructed defenses, and for the first time in the war, Hitler canceled an operation before it had achieved tactical or operational success. This decision was partially affected by the Western Allies' invasion of Sicily launched on 9th of July, which, combined with previous Italian failures, resulted in the ousting and arrest of Mussolini later that month. On July 12, 1943, the Soviets launched their own counteroffensives, thereby nearly completely dispelling any chance of German victory or even stalemate in the east. The Soviet victory at Kursk marked the end of German superiority, giving the Soviet Union the initiative on the Eastern Front. The Germans tried to stabilize their eastern front along the hastily fortified Panther-Votan line, but the Soviets broke through it at Smolensk and the Lower Dnieper offensive. On September 3, 1943, the Western Allies invaded the Italian mainland, following Italy's armistice with the Allies and the ensuing German occupation of Italy. Germany, with the help of the Fascists, responded to the armistice by disarming Italian forces that were in many places without superior orders, seizing military control of Italian areas, and creating a series of defensive lines. German special forces then rescued Mussolini, who then soon established a new client state in German-occupied Italy named the Italian Social Republic, causing an Italian civil war. The Western Allies fought through several lines until reaching the main German defensive line in mid-November. German operations in the Atlantic also suffered. By May 1943, as Allied countermeasures became increasingly effective, the resulting sizable German submarine losses forced a temporary halt of the German Atlantic naval campaign. In November 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met with Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo and then with Joseph Stalin in Tehran. The former conference determined the post-war return of Japanese territory and the military planning for the Burma campaign, while the latter included agreement that the Western Allies would invade Europe in 1944 and that the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. From November 1943, during the 7-week Battle of Chang'an, the Chinese awaited Allied relief as they forced Japan to fight a costly war of attrition. In January 1944, the Allies launched a series of attacks in Italy against the line at Monte Cassino and tried to outflank it with landings at Anzio. On January 27, 1944, Soviet troops launched a major offensive that expelled German forces from the Leningrad region, thereby ending the most lethal siege in history. The following Soviet offensive was halted on the pre-war Estonian border by the German Army Group North aided by Estonians hoping to re-establish national independence. This delay slowed subsequent Soviet operations in the Baltic Sea region. By late May 1944, the Soviets had liberated Crimea, largely expelled Axis forces from Ukraine, and made incursions into Romania, which were repulsed by the Axis troops. The Allied offensives in Italy had succeeded and, at the cost of allowing several German divisions to retreat, Rome was captured on 4th of June. The Allies had mixed success in mainland Asia. On June 6, 1944, commonly known as D-Day, after 3 years of Soviet pressure, 277, the Western Allies invaded northern France. After reassigning several Allied divisions from Italy, they also attacked southern France. 278. These landings were successful and led to the defeat of the German army units in France. Paris was liberated on 25th of August by the local resistance assisted by the Free French forces, both led by General Charles de Gaulle, 279, and the Western Allies continued to push back German forces in Western Europe during the latter part of the year. An attempt to advance into northern Germany spearheaded by a major airborne operation in the Netherlands failed. 280. After that, the Western Allies slowly pushed into Germany, but failed to cross the Ruhr River. In Italy, the Allied advance slowed due to the last major German defensive line. 281. On 22nd of June, the Soviets launched a strategic offensive in Belarus that nearly destroyed the German Army Group Center. 282. Soon after that, another Soviet strategic offensive forced German troops from western Ukraine and eastern Poland. The Soviet Red Army, however, halted in the Praga district on the other side of the Vistula as the Germans quelled the Warsaw Uprising initiated by the Home Army, the main faction of the Polish resistance, loyal to the non-communist government in exile, killing over 150,000 Poles. 283. The national uprising in Slovakia was also quelled by the Germans. 284. The Soviet Red Army's strategic offensive in eastern Romania cut off and destroyed the considerable German troops there and triggered a successful coup d'etat in Romania and in Bulgaria, followed by those countries' shift to the Allied side. 285. General Douglas MacArthur returns to the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte, October 20, 1944 and September 1944. Soviet troops advanced into Yugoslavia and forced the rapid withdrawal of German Army Groups E and F in Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia to rescue them from being cut off. 286. By this point, the Communist communist-led partisans under Marshal Josip Broz Tito, who had led an increasingly successful guerrilla campaign against the occupation since 1941, controlled much of the territory of Yugoslavia and engaged in delaying efforts against German forces further south. In northern Serbia, the Soviet Red Army, with limited support from Bulgarian forces, assisted the partisans in a joint liberation of the capital city of Belgrade on 20th of October. A few days later, the Soviets launched a massive assault against German-occupied Hungary that lasted until the fall of Budapest in February 1945. 287. Unlike rapid Soviet victories in the Balkans, bitter Finnish resistance to the Soviet offensive in the Karelian Isthmus denied the Soviets' occupation of Finland and led to a Soviet-Finnish armistice on relatively mild conditions. 288, although Finland was obligated to fight their German former allies. 289. By the start of July 1944, Commonwealth forces in Southeast Asia had repelled the Japanese sieges in Assam, pushing the Japanese back to the Chinguan River 290, while the Chinese captured Miyachina. In September 1944, Chinese forces captured Mount Song and reopened the Burma Road. 291. In China, the Japanese had more successes, having finally captured Changsha in mid-June and the city of Hengyang by early August. 292. Soon after, they invaded the province of Guangxi, winning major engagements against Chinese forces at Guilin and Liuzhou by the end of November 293, and successfully linking up their forces in China and Indochina by mid-December. 294. In the Pacific, U.S. forces continued to push back the Japanese perimeter. In mid-June 1944, they began their offensive against the Mariana and Palau Islands and decisively defeated Japanese forces in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. These defeats led to the resignation of the Japanese Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, and provided the United States with air bases to launch intensive heavy bomber attacks on the Japanese home islands. In late October, American forces invaded the Filipino island of Leyte. Soon after, Allied naval forces scored another large victory in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history. 209.
The Allies established occupation administrations in Austria and Germany, both initially divided between Western and Eastern occupation zones controlled by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, respectively. However, their paths soon diverged. In Germany, the Western and Eastern occupation zones officially ended in 1949, with the respective zones becoming separate countries, West Germany and East Germany. In Austria, however, occupation continued until 1955, when a joint settlement between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union permitted the reunification of Austria as a democratic state officially non-aligned with any political bloc, although in practice having better relations with the Western Allies. A denazification program in Germany led to the prosecution of Nazi war criminals in the Nuremberg trials and the removal of ex-Nazis from power, although this policy moved towards amnesty and reintegration of ex-Nazis into West German society. Germany lost a quarter of its pre-war, 1937, territory. Among the eastern territories, Silesia, Neumark and most of Pomerania were taken over by Poland, and East Prussia was divided between Poland and the Soviet Union, followed by the expulsion to Germany of the 9 million Germans from these provinces, as well as 3 million Germans from the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. By the 1950s, 1/5 of West Germans were refugees from the East. The Soviet Union also took over the Polish provinces east of the Curzon Line, from which 2 million Poles were expelled. Northeastern Romania, parts of eastern Finland, and the Baltic states were annexed into the Soviet Union. Italy lost its monarchy, colonial empire, and some European territories. In an effort to maintain world peace, the Allies formed the United Nations, which officially came into existence on the 24th of October 1945. And adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 as a common standard for all member nations. The great powers that were the victors of the war, France, China, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States, became the permanent members of the UN Security Council. The 5 permanent members remain so to the present, although there have been 2 seat changes between the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China in 1971. And between the Soviet Union and its successor state, the Russian Federation, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. The alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had begun to deteriorate even before the war was over. Besides Germany, the rest of Europe was also divided into Western and Soviet spheres of influence. Most Eastern and Central European countries fell into the Soviet sphere, which led to the establishment of communist-led regimes, with full or partial support of the Soviet occupation authorities. As a result, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Albania became Soviet satellite states. Communist Yugoslavia conducted a fully independent policy, causing tension with the Soviet Union. A communist uprising in Greece was put down with Anglo-American support, and the country remained aligned with the West. Post-war division of the world was formalized by two international military alliances, the United States-led NATO and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. The long period of political tensions and military competition between them, the Cold War, would be accompanied by an unprecedented arms race and number of proxy wars throughout the world. In Asia, the United States led the occupation of Japan and administered Japan's former islands in the Western Pacific, while the Soviets annexed South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. Korea, formerly under Japanese colonial rule, was divided and occupied by the Soviet Union in the north and the United States in the south between 1945 and 1948. Separate republics emerged on both sides of the 38th parallel in 1948, each claiming to be the legitimate government for all of Korea, which led ultimately to the Korean War. In China, nationalist and communist forces resumed the civil war in June 1946. Communist forces prevailed and established the People's Republic of China on the mainland, while nationalist forces retreated to Taiwan in 1949. In the Middle East, the Arab rejection of the United Nations partition plan for Palestine and the creation of Israel marked the escalation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. While European powers attempted to retain some or all of their colonial empires, their losses of prestige and resources during the war rendered this unsuccessful, leading to decolonization.
If you enjoyed this video, please take a quick look at these analytics. 98% of you who watch this are not subscribed, and 1% of you are. So if you enjoyed the video made this far, please subscribe and watch another one. Thank you.